Hey y'all, welcome to the channel. I'm Task Force Bourbon. Today we're in for a treat. We're here to discuss something that many of you all have experienced already at some point, and probably in a number of different ways. If you can guess by the shirt I'm wearing, yes, we're going to be talking about old fashions. Don't ask me the plural sense of the word, because I don't think anybody truly knows that. But everything other than that, we're going to figure it out together. So, as is normal with all my channel, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the history of the old-fashioned as well as we know it to be, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how and why some of those things ended up where they are in terms of the recipe, and then I'm going to share to you at the very end, I got a special treat in store for some of you who decide to stay along for the ride and have an open mind. So, without further ado, we'll get started. So, right up front, the executive summary in old fashioned essentially is it's a stirred drink. It's usually served in a glass, like you see here, right? It's usually stirred. However, it has been shaken at points, and it can be shaken still. Typically, you're going to see both either a rye or a bourbon, and again, sometimes both, right? But whereas, and we'll get into exactly, what and why, rye or bourbon is maybe the more preferred method to do it. But whereas rye will provide you a spicier type of kick in your cocktail, the bourbon is going to provide you more of a softer, mellower approach to the evening. But both are suitable base spirits to utilize in the cocktail. So it's dealer's choice. For the sweetener, purists muddle up sugar cube with water and a couple dashes of bitters, but simple syrup also works just as well. And it really depends if you're talking a 1-to-1 ratio. Or a 2-to-1 ratio, so really that depends on the bar that you're in or what you're doing at home. Twists, if you're into that, can be orange, lemon, or both, and those are known as rabbit ears in the cocktail mixology community. A fruited version of the drink did come into vogue after Prohibition and involves the muddling of a cherry and orange slice along with the sugar. Right, that's where you're starting to get a lot of contention in the community. We're going to talk about why that exists, and maybe if it's Task Force Bourbon's personal preference or not, right? But today, there's probably more ways to make an old-fashioned than there are cocktails on the market. With that said, most all of them use Angostura bitters. We'll also get into that a bit as well. And then finally, we'll save smoking for the very last. To do or not to do. To smoke or not to smoke. All right. But before we do that, let's get into the bourbon, right? Because this is Task Force Bourbon, not Task Force Rye or Task Force Bourbon and Rye. So Nick Christensen from Barrelcraft's Spirit Single Barrel Program, manager and a total pro behind the bar, right? Quote unquote. She's worked everywhere from Top Chef to you name it. She said that the next thing I look for is proof and age in a bourbon, right? And so she doesn't like to go lower than 100 proof, right? Because as she says, you can start to lose the distinguishing qualities of the bourbon. 100 proof straight bourbon can create a consistent, delicious old fashioned. But she really loves a 105 to 112 range. All right, she adds this is why she loves cask strength bourbons, and especially as they pertain to mixing in an old fashioned. She says she also typically wants something 6 years or older. She loves the 8 to 15 year range. All right, I can't disagree. I'm a cask strength guy myself, but I typically go for the Buffalo Trace, which as most of us know, sit around the 90 proof range. Okay. And that's dealer's choice again. What I have in store today, spoiler alert, will not involve Buffalo Trace. So going into that history that I promised, right, we're gonna go way back, starting in May 13th, 1806. All right, so close your eyes with me. So the issue of the Balanced and Columbian Repository, Harry Croswell answered a reader's query from the previous week, defining a cocktail for all posterity as, quote, and here, this is where it's important, a stimulating liquor composed of spirits of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. The end. That's the blueprint for what you all should start to recognize as an old-fashioned. All right, so when somebody asks you, rye's the way to go, rye's the original OG way, bourbon is the OG way, none of those are the OG way, use X, Y, and Z. You can refer back to that because technically speaking, a cocktail, right? And that's where, really the true origins of the old-fashioned name derived from was simply a stimulating liquor. All right, but it's evolved since then, so now it does include whiskey, and we'll get into that for right next. So for many decades, it went by the name whiskey cocktail. So if you wanted your version of your cocktail that, as it were, stimulating liquor to be whiskey, you would just order a whiskey cocktail. So that was typically served without ice, and it was considered a morning drink where it was commonly drunk in the morning as an eye opener. Okay, by the 1840s, roughly, it gained a lot of popularity, and the young cats were all drinking it, and you weren't hip, cool, or great, grand, or wonderful if you weren't drinking an old-fashioned, so it got a lot of popularity. And that brings us to 1862, and this brings us to a book entitled Jerry Thomas's Bartender's Guide, How to Mix Drinks. All right, it's published. Gives instructions for a lot of early day bartending and a lot of other cocktails as well that still are used today. One of those is an old-fashioned, of course, but it was an old-fashioned Holland gin cocktail, where he said, quote, crush a small lump of sugar in a whiskey glass containing a little water. Add a lump of ice. 2 dashes of Angostura bitters. There's that Angostura we talked about. A small piece of lemon peel, 1 jigger Holland gin, mixed with small bar spoon, serve. That's it. While the drink has the namesake and similar elements of the modern old-fashioned, Thomas's recipe doesn't call for whiskey, and it's never mentioned in any of the preceding articles. Right? But that's where the first time you see that, old-fashioned name sort of really come up, and this is where this gets confusing. It gets confusing, right? Because how it was ordered later is not necessarily related to this now. So, beginning in the 1870s, bartenders are all now, super hip and, all cool guys. And so what they're doing is they're taking all these new available liquors, they're improvising all these cocktails. They're, at the time calling them modern cocktails, right? Obviously not so much now. Using enhancers like curacao, maraschino, absinthe, and old-timer traditionalists who wanted what they had before are asking for the old-fashioned version. So there you have it. That's really where that name starts to really pick up and trend in terms of what we know it to be today. So again, their pleas for simple concoctions eventually turned into the recipe itself, which is great, right? Because we like it. So here is another point of contention in the 1880s. All right, I'm going to start first with Kentucky, right? The story starts in Louisville, right, as most do. It credits to a private gentleman's social club called the Pendennis Club, as making the very first old-fashioned. James E. Pepper was a bartender, steam bourbon aristocrat. There's a bourbon named after him now. All right, was said to have invented the drink in Louisville before he brought the recipe to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. So this is supposedly where the old-fashioned was born. The origin story, however, is unlikely true. I'll explain that in just a sec. But this is where you get that battle between New York and Kentucky as who created it first. Does it really matter? Not really, right? Again, that's kind of been debunked. This is, again, controversial, but generally it's been debunked because the Chicago Daily Tribune, February 15th, 1880, publishes an article, and this is before the Pendennis Club was even opened, right? In addition to the fact that the old-fashioned was simply repackaging of a drink that had long existed, right, as we talked about just previously. And that was in an article announcing Samuel Tilden, the 25th mayor of New York and former Democratic candidate for the U.S. presidency, has withdrawn from the United States presidential election. In this article, the author mentioned how Tilden's withdrawal was met, quote, hot whiskeys, Scotch and Irish, particularly the latter, sour mashes, and old-fashioned cocktails were drank in honor of the event. So again, you're seeing that name old-fashioned now in a publicized manner. Not necessarily a recipe yet, with old-fashioned, whiskey old-fashioned name tied to it. That happens in 1895. Now we're in 1895, right? The first whiskey old-fashioned recipe was printed in what was called the Modern American Drinks, written by George Kappeler, right? It lists a plethora of recipes, again, like most, cocktail, bartending books do. One of those was obviously the old-fashioned, and what it reads is, quote, dissolve a small lump of sugar with a little water in a whiskey glass, add 2 dashes Angostura bitters, there again, a small piece of ice, a piece of lemon peel, 1 jigger whiskey, mix with small bar spoon and serve, leaving spoon in glass. So if you're not drinking your old-fashioned with a spoon, are you really drinking an old-fashioned? I'm not drinking my old-fashioned with a spoon, even if I followed that to the T, right, other than that. And you'll notice that there's no oranges in there. There's no cherries in there. None of that is in there yet. That doesn't really start to come out around until the Prohibition era, or post-Prohibition even, right? That's another debatable line in the bourbon community, or the old-fashioned community, I guess. And what that involves, for those that don't know, is essentially a cherry and an orange is oftentimes muddled, sometimes just thrown in a mix, but oftentimes muddled in with the sugar cube. And that practice probably began as a way to obfuscate or completely hide poor spirits that they had available at the time during Prohibition and just after Prohibition. That seemed to have stuck around. When you get out of Prohibition, you start to see every major recipe, bartending book after that always involving oranges and cherries and other fruits. It gets really crazy, involving pineapple and you name it, right? It's all in there. And so just briefly, let's talk about Angostura, because we've seen that twice in writing now at this point, and probably much more if we were to really dig into the weeds. Angostura Bitters was developed as a tonic by Johann Siegart, which is a German Surgeon General in Simon Bolivar's army in Venezuela. Those of you that don't, or aren't aware, Simon Bolivar's greatest accomplishments, numero uno, is the Spanish colonies, or freeing the Spanish colonies, He freed 5 South American countries in the 1800s. He freed his, obviously, natal Venezuela, plus Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. For that, he has repeatedly been called, quote, the George Washington of South America. But back to Siegart. He became fascinated with the herbs and plants in the area while serving for the infamous El Liberator, Simon Bolivar. He experimented with different blends and mixtures to create bitter medicine to boost the health of the troops. When Bolivar finally moved to the fight across Latin America, Siegart stuck around Angostura and kept working on his recipe. Siegart and his sons moved operations to Trinidad, sold cases of their bitters to international royalty, and hired a sugar technologist. To this day, the House of Angostura bottles up bitters for the world to enjoy using the same recipe Siegart came up with back in 1824. It's speculated that the recipe contains over 40 ingredients, but only 5 people in the entire planet know the actual formula. Just 5. All right, but more than that, enjoy it. Now, we know what an old-fashioned is in terms of how to make it, right? At this point, via the recipes we went over. And so, to recap, essentially, you've got some level of a few sugar cubes in there, which, for those that have never seen a sugar cube before, something like that, thrown in there, mixed with maybe a bit of water, maybe not, mixed with some bitters. That's always a definite, right? Poured with a heavy spirit, in this case, whiskey of some kind. In my case, bourbon of some kind. And then maybe or maybe not oranges, cherries, muddled or not muddled, right? With or without ice. So really, all that means for you is you to know where you fit in that lineage, right? You can like it however you want, right? Technically, it comes back from ordering it the old-fashioned way, which would be the most simplistic way of ordering that. I want a cocktail the old-fashioned way. An old-fashioned whiskey cocktail. That's the full name, right? But you can order it really any way you please. It's evolved much so since then. Just know where you fall in the lineup and know that necessarily not wrong. You're just from a different era in the old-fashioned origin story. Now, moving into modern days, right, we get to things like smoking. And I'll pull over my smoker now. I have is infusing in it, where I infuse sugar cubes in a little separate glass using a separate smoking device, which I load on the top here some wood chips. Light it and I attach a hose to it. It looks like this, a hose, pretty standard issue stuff, and smoke it. Really, we started to see that first in 2007 when New York barkeep Eben Freeman conjured up the much-loved Waylon, that's what he calls this drink, named after Waylon Jennings, It is essentially an adaptation of a Jack and Coke, but Freeman mixes Jim Beam Black, bourbon, and smoked Coca-Cola, house-made, with cherry and alderwood. All right, that's really the first time we start to see smoking in modern times. Obviously, in the whiskey sense and alcohol sense, you see that much earlier with scotches, i.e., peat, or different variations of tequila, mezcal. And so that's just a reminder of where that comes from, that peaty Scotch whiskey and mezcal from Oaxaca. The distinctive flavors inherent to each are derived from the production process, where raw materials, barley and agave respectively, get basically that slow roast treatment. How I do it, if you're into smoking, this isn't a smoking lesson, but I do like a twice smoked thing. And what I mean by that is the very first part, I infuse, right? Like you see here with my sugar cubes. I infuse the sugar. After each time, I add more sugar cubes to this, and I let whatever's left over in this house, and I sit it in there and just let it rest. If you don't have anything and you're starting fresh, you can just do that, with the sugar cubes. You can do that if you want to use the cocktail cherry in there, or the orange peel itself. You can let that sit in there about 2 minutes while that infuses into that garnish and whatnot, and then set it aside, because then the second smoking is going to be the cocktail itself. Once you obviously add whatever you need to add in back at that point, you would obviously have the sugar already in there. And then, you could throw the orange peel, garnishes in afterwards, right? That's just another way. Some people do up to like 3 smokings, so they'll do that and then they'll smoke it once more. But about 2 minutes is a good rule of thumb. You can do less than that. There's all kinds of, smoked, smoking options. This is a box I got from Amazon, and it has like 6 different kinds of wood. You see here I got, pecan, I got hickory, applewood, cherry, and I think, and it's not to be funny, but I think cherry works the best for me in terms of the flavor profile that I'm trying to achieve. The best way to know is to experiment. Get a good smoker, get some wood. The wood's not cheap. The smoker might cost you a little bit, but other than that, it's not so bad. How I make my old fashions is I take what we have here is just Angostura bitters. It's obviously been rebottled in something a little nicer than the bottle it comes in. I got orange, Angostura bitters, and then I got Peychards, right? It's more of a fruity type profile, and then sometimes you get like Fee Brothers. That's another one you'll see. But what I do is I take 2 sugar cubes, into my glass. I douse one with your typical standard issue Angostura and the other with the orange. I add half an ounce of water. I muddle that, together. Let that basically create its own sort of like cold, simple syrup, if you will. Then I add in the orange. This is a small slice of orange and a cherry. I muddle that all together. Yep, that's where I fit in the line. So you see where I am now. And then once that's got a second to rest together, I throw in a big ice cube. You want to use a big ice. I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. And then afterwards, I then pour over the bourbon on top of that. And like I told you already, I use Buffalo Trace for that recipe. And then that's it. I stir about 7 times. And then that's the end of the day. So when I talked about ice for a second, this is what's called a directional freezer. Really cheap, $20, $30 off of Amazon. It makes 4 ice cubes, and I'll show you what it looks like. The only thing this does is it makes clear ice cubes. So if you just really want to church up your game, you can do something like this. So as you see inside, right, it's got 3 compartments, right? And what you do is you put the first one in. Here's it again. It's a big empty bucket with it looks like it's going to make 4 square ice cubes. You put the second one on top, and then you put in your water. And essentially, all directional freezing is a simple method to create, like I said, crystal clear ice cubes. But it allows the water to freeze into ice from only one direction, one side of the container, and the ice will be clear until the very last part to freeze, and if that last part freezes at all. So these top 4 will be clear ice cubes. These bottom 4, if they're frozen at all, will be completely regular ice cubes. And then for those of you looking at doing some extra credit here, you can get a copy of this. This is where I would recommend starting if you're really into old fashions or the history of them, making different variations of them. There's other books out there. If you're into really getting it advanced, I'm going to pull this. I in the screen here. This is a book about bitters. Bitters is a major component, obviously, in old fashions. You don't have to use Angostura. You can even make your own. It's a very complicated process. Like you heard with Angostura, probably around 40 ingredients. Now, what I would recommend to you is find where you sit in the old-fashioned palate. Are you here for the sugar? Do you want more sugar? Are you here for the bitters? If so, what bitters? They make chocolate bitters. They make, like I said, I got 3 right in front of me, right here now. Are you here for the different types of cherries? You want bada bing? Do you want maraschino, like I got here? And I'll show you why I'm doing them in a moment. I typically use bada bing. Do you like the smoking? Do you want a really heavy smoke? Or are you here for the bourbon or the whiskey or the rye? Are you, if that's the case, maybe look to what we talked about before is using a very high proof bourbon, an older aged bourbon, and having that stand out and maybe lower the percentages of what you're adding in terms of, the bitters, the sugar, the water, right? So I'm going to set these aside. And we'll get started on the treat I have in store today. This is the very first. I have never had this, God's honest. What we're going to be doing is making a island or tropical old-fashioned. That's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it tropical old-fashioned. All right. So what I've been told is you're supposed to use a wheated bourbon like Maker's Mark. In the case that I've already said before with the higher proof stuff, I would probably be inclined to use a cask strength Maker's. But we're not going to do that. I have before me Breckenridge Rum Cask Finished bourbon. And so this is a bourbon that I just did a sampling of a moment ago, and I'll post those later as it was individually by itself, neat. But essentially this is just their bourbon, which is about a blend of 4 to 10 year aged bourbons that was then laid to rest in their own house-made, traditional style house-made spiced rum barrels, right? And so what you get there is a lot of, that tropical type of taste to it. To me, it reminded me a bit of the Angel's Envy Rye, for those that have had that. All right, so we'll go ahead first start by building it. I will be using some smoked sugar cubes, excuse me. I'm going to use 2, like I said. Throw 2 in there. I'll move this maybe backwards so you can see it better. And my goodness, that smells like a campfire. Like the best kind. Like if you were involved with that campfire all night, you were the person stoking that campfire, you were feeding it all night, everybody else was having a great time, but you were by the fire all night, and then you just smelled your sweater the next morning, in the best way possible. That's what that smells like. Fantastic. It's mainly been infused with cherry and I believe some hickory because I did some experimenting with those cubes. And so we put those in there right now. And I'm going to put in Angostura bitters. Take off the cap here. It's been a moment. All right. So I'm just going to hold this cap and put a few drops of it in there. Just enough to coat the sugar cubes. Okay. So we got the bitters in there. Now I'm going to add a half an ounce of water, right? Okay, so we have sugar, smoked sugar, infused smoked sugar cubes with Angostura bitters and half an ounce of water. I'm then going to muddle that together. Now, back in the day, back in about the 30s, you really started to see the utilization of spoons, right? But they had special spoons where this tip was flat, and sometimes you'll see them now still where the end is flat. But it would call it a cherry or a muddler spoon. Cherry muddler spoon, cherry spoon, muddler spoon. I've seen it by all names. But you can crush it with this if it's not going to give you too much trouble like it is right here, right now, out of all times for it to give me trouble. I'm going to grab my actual muddler off screen for a second. Sometimes it calls, you got to call in the big guns. And those cubes. So what I have noticed with the sugar cubes, and maybe I haven't done this in a scientific, situation here I've done, but regular sugar cubes seem to crush up pretty easy. But once I've infused them, it seems like they seem to crush a lot harder than when they weren't infused. And just as a note to self here for you all, bitters stains the heck out of you. So if you don't, if you get it on your skin, it's probably going to be there the next day, even after washing your hands. So I would recommend trying to, be as cleansely as possible as you, work your way through this cocktail. And for the record, I am a bourbon steward. I know all about lots of bourbon. I like to think I do, at least. I am not a mixologist. I'm not a bartender. So if I'm messing something up, I'm probably committing blasphemy. Some of you bartenders, gritting your teeth. Give me a little wiggle room here, okay? Don't beat me up. Okay, another unique part of this cocktail calls for, you guessed it, pineapple. Can't be a tropical old-fashioned without a pineapple. So I'm going to take the top off here. All right, I'm just going to get a little piece. I want to eat the rest later, definitely. I love pineapple. Spent some time in Hawaii, so I'm a little biased when it comes to my pineapple, but you take what you can get sometimes. All right, I'm going to just cut off a big old square piece here. Set the side away for now. Okay. Got a nice piece. Because I actually want to probably eat it later, I'm just going to cut off a bit of the center there. I'm just going to mix that in there. That's what it says to do. I don't know. This is the first. Oh, I got to make it smaller than that, or it's not going to fit in. All right. There you go. Put a little small little piece in there. Let's move this out of the way. Okay. What's next is very unique. This is not a directional freezer, is coconut water instead of your regular water. So we're going to throw in a cube of that now. If it fits. My goodness, it barely fits. Let me get a napkin there. All right. Then what we're going to do is build the bourbon over the ice. You always want to do it that way instead of the other way around, right? You don't want to add your bourbon and then put your ice in. All right. I like the way bourbon tastes, so I'm going to go ahead and add 2 ounces. Okay, there's a 1.5 ounce side. And here's your 1/2 ounce side. All right, so I'm not a geologist, but that's about 2 ounces. Okay, we'll set that aside. And last but definitely not least, the maraschino cherry. Feel free to add a little bit of the juice alongside. Ooh, made a mess. How about 2 cherries? All right, there it is. So I talked about old fashions, making it the old fashioned way, and that this is why you do it and all that good stuff. And then I go ahead and commit blasphemy like this. Some of you guys are gonna maybe unsubscribe and never follow me again, or send me a bunch of hate mail. But I just thought it was fun. I saw it. We'll see how it tastes. I just made this. Hopefully the coconut water, it's already starting to melt actually. And I just took it out of the freezer. And so, it's already like melting. So maybe it doesn't, freeze as well and it's been frozen for about 36 hours now. And, but it's already melting. Let's go ahead and give it a sip. Okay, so when you have a beard, it gets everywhere. It's definitely sweeter than my typical old fashioned. Surprise. I think that could be a lot of the maraschino cherries compared to the Bada Bing, more richer, heartier cherries that I usually use. I doubt the pineapple juice is really making a stink in there right now because I just added it. It's not really had time to marinate. Maybe get a little bit more of a mix. This is actually, I think for a cocktail like this, given the size of the pineapple and whatnot, I would suggest maybe building it in maybe a different glass, a bigger glass. And hopefully that coconut decides to melt and does something good in there. So again, it's sweet, but not like a sugary sweet. I like my regular old fashions better. But this, I could see drinking this like on the beach. And sometimes the Angostura does have those heartier type flavors, and it gives that like more of a after dinner type aperitif kind of deal going on or whatever. Whereas like if you were to just use the regular orange bitters, very fruity, very light, it reminds me of that, but without the orange flavor. Obviously, there's no orange in here, and it doesn't have this because this has its own sort of unique thing going on. I won't spoil it for you guys, so that way you can try it yourself. But as far as this goes, again, let me get another sip. Yeah, that coconut is starting to mix in there. You gotta like coconut, and you gotta like a sweeter cocktail without going, into like, I wouldn't call this a fruity drink, despite the fact that there's, cherries and pineapples both in here. But it's still very good. I recommend giving it a shot if you got time. Let's see what we might have as far as questions and answers. I'm going to lean in here so I can read. So we got Rich A. Sanders saying, finally, you're explaining this to me. All right. Well, I'm glad I was able to help. And I hope you find the perfect cocktail for you. Joe to it. So you are not into spooning. Oh, I definitely am. I'm the little spoon. Ginger Noonan, true. Another loophole. It has fruit in it. Mm-hmm. Food is for the weak, says JP Aguirre. Yep. Ginger Noonan says, I'm guessing it's frowned upon now to drink one in the morning. I guess it depends on who you work for. Okay. Any other questions or answers? Anybody has anything else about, an old fashioned, how to make one, some of the history? If not, then what I'm going to say to you all is cheers while I go ahead and finish this off. Pretty good, really refreshing.